An indictment filed Wednesday alleges that a media company linked to 6 conservative influencers, including well-known personalities Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Benny Johnson, was secretly funded by Russian state media employees to churn out English-language videos that were often consistent with the Kremlin's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to Russian interests, like its war in Ukraine. The U.S. Justice Department doesn't allege any wrongdoing by the influencers, some of whom it says were given false information about the source of the company's funding. Instead, it accuses 2 employees of RT, Romeo Tango, a Russian state media company, of funneling nearly $10 million to a Tennessee-based content creation company for Russia-friendly content. After the indictments were announced, both Poole and Johnson issued statements on social media, which Rubin retweeted, saying they were victims of the alleged crimes and had done nothing wrong. This name, which is, I am going to totally fuck up, Kostiantin Kalashnikov and Elena Afanasova are charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering and violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They are at large, and it was not immediately clear if they have lawyers. Thoughts?
Man, scary, because I've worked with Rubin. I've also worked with Poole. And, I used to be on Rubin's platform, Locals. I actually had the biggest channel, the highest monetizing channel on Rubin's platform, which was called Locals. We migrated because of our inability to kind of do certain things that we wanted to do. And then he winded up selling it. I did Tim Poole's show a couple of years back, likely when this was going on. But look, it's a lot of this, especially being dug up by the Department of Justice. The first thing I do when the government does anything is I go, what's the real angle here? I mean, a great example of that is just recently, 11 months after the fact, we just issued indictments for the terrorists involved in the October 7th attack. And these indictments were obviously against Hamas because we wanted to show a statement of solidarity and we're not going to let these people get away. And I listened to this and I'm like, really? So what's the angle? What's a political end? That they're obviously doing this for political reasons because they're making a statement. I mean, 3, I think, of the 7 people they named have been killed by the Israelis. So it's just a matter of them checking the block. So when I hear Russians were involved in some way, and then the government miraculously investigated them and then was digging up all the information that the Russians had to do with this hoax, I also remember back to the last 3.5 years where we were talking about, the last 4 years prior to the 3.5 years of this Russian hoax. And I also think back and think about all the corruption that the U.S. government has been coming out with recently. And I think to myself, like, what's the real story here? Likely there was money that was trickled in from sponsorships. And then what was the influence and what was the impact? Likely slight, if best. I mean, what did they do? Did they give an advertisement and say that during a show? Did they have talking points that were associated with some kind of mis or disinformation? Who knows? And this is like a second, third order proxy event that took place. And I wonder what the DOJ is really doing, because at the same time they're digging up influencer ties to Russian money, they're also using lawfare to go after Trump. And I see that and I'm like, dude, like, if you just do your job, if you actually just go after real corruption, I don't know, like the Epstein client list, like who was on that list and why aren't we talking about that? Then maybe we could actually get some good done. And so I hear that and they name those guys by name. And immediately I thought, man, I hope these guys are in trouble. But because the worst case scenario for me is, like the government has done with me personally in declaring me a domestic threat to American national security, I hope these guys don't get rolled up and put in prison for absolutely nothing. or for something minor that they likely didn't even know they had involvement in, which seems to be the case.
Yeah, I wish I could say this one really blows my hair back. But if I really look at this and even just reading through it again as you're talking, it does not surprise me at all that Russia would do something like this. And in the same breath, what I'm going to say is it wouldn't surprise me at all if the United States was constantly doing this as well, because this is just a classic psychological operation. You are at a national level, not, it's not a kinetic war. And most people, most wars, I would say, that people are fighting in their day-to-day life or political wars, most of them are not kinetic, right? We live in an information-based society. So we're looking at a government who has a desire to influence people, whether they were successful or not. I think that's an interesting conversation because I really would like to see the mechanics of that. And I'll get to this to that in a second, because you and I kind of both know the behind the scenes of how podcast sponsorship works. And I've never had a direct link to a sponsor. Most of the time it's through a proxy ad buyer. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of steps between somebody in Russia moving money and a message coming out of somebody's mouth that may not even have anything to do with the person trying to deliver the message, other than making sure that the routing number and checking account number are correct. But this, like if you look at it like a psychological operation, you find the audience that you want to serve with the message that you want to serve. And of course, the best way to do it, to change or influence people inside of the United States, is going to be from people inside of the United States that are already influential. Their goal would be in this type of operation to, maybe if you look at it like a flag blowing in the wind, maybe direct it 10 degrees more in the direction that you want to go. They're obviously not going to do an ad read like, Gratzvitzen, Kak Pushevayetsa, welcome to the new, no, that's not how this shit works. It would have to be small, subtle manipulation over time. As somebody who has, and again, before I get into the mechanics of how I've had this stuff work in my own life, and by that I mean podcast sponsorship and how detached, honestly, the host or the people involved can be, there is, in my estimation, an incredibly low chance that the United States is not doing this exact same type of thing. There is, whether people want to admit it or not, constant warfare between ideologies. And the Western ideologies are oftentimes at odds with other ideologies throughout the world. And just, in my opinion, I don't think for a second that the U.S. government is not doing this as well through either alphabet soup organizations or proxy organizations that those alphabet soup organizations have a 1099 contract with, but happen to be founded by people from said organization. We've seen this stuff play itself out enough times, so it doesn't surprise me. I could also see, and I've never met Poole, Rubin, or Benny Johnson. I peripherally know who they are. I could also see them being the recipient of money and having absolutely no idea where it came from. Because again, as somebody who's hosted a podcast now for getting closer to 10 years than it has been to 5, it's oftentimes it starts with an email, an ad broker that works with a stable of brands that has money that they want to spend, reaches out to your platform because they either like the topics that you cover or the audience that they think that you align with. And it's often very transactional. Here's the bullet points that we want you to talk about on this particular topic. How you would roll into that, a pro-Russia message, I'm not necessarily sure. Unless they thought that the hosts themselves had that type of messaging. I'm not sure on that. But in full transparency, I have never tried to work where the dollars come from upstream beyond an ad buyer. Meaning I could see myself having had something like this happen because I've never tried to forensically see exactly where the money is coming from, because quite frankly, I don't have the fucking time.
Yeah, I think the question I asked myself, if the DOJ is chasing the money, which it seems like that's where it started, they were probably chasing money network and then landed on these influencers. Why are they not looking at politicians and the fact that there are politicians worth hundreds of millions of dollars when they make $100,000 a year for being politicians? Like how that happens and how that's not regulated and how that's not looked into. That's a more significant question that American people are asking themselves. And I get it. You follow the money, you find out influencers were here. And I'm glad at least the DOJ is saying these influencers had nothing to do with the potential wrongdoing. Just recently, I mean, this is just in the headlines, the New York governor's assistant, come to find out she's a agent for China. It's like, those are the things that we need to be looking into and investigating. And, I think it's always important to kind of be transparent about all these things, but it just seems like, how come we're not seeing a trove of politicians in America being called out by the DOJ for corruption? Because we know it exists. Well, if they're not looking into that, then they're not going to find what they're looking for. So it seems like in this case, they happen to be conservative influencers. So is that a bias? I think so. I think the DOJ and all of its recent transactions against Trump especially seems to be very biased in where they're investigating and where they're not. And conservative, everybody seems to be the target, because you're seeing this in the news nearly every week. It's a new conservative influencer, politician, Trump, etc., that seem to be coming out, and nobody else. And that's the biggest issue I have with it.
Officials are warning of a widespread cybersecurity attack.
Frustrations and delays have continued as countless are still without power.
Market volatility is at its highest since the pandemic.
There are a number of reports across the state.
An unidentified threat. There is no doubt our grid is at risk.
The target is entering airspace.
What do you think the role is of the host of those shows? Like, you and I both have a podcast, but right now, right with Focal Point, we're working with IRONCLAD. They're producing the podcast. What level of responsibility should you and I have, or a production company that you're working with, to ensure the origin of advertising dollars is not coming from a foreign entity like this? Because I'm going to be honest, I don't have the tools to forensically chase that and reverse engineer it. I can't speak for IRONCLAD. I don't know if they have those abilities, but where does the responsibility lie here? I mean, I'm not an idiot when it comes to technology, but I am so far from being a international monetary expert. I have no ability to look into banking transaction, wiring, any of those things, nor would a production company. So where do you think the responsibility on this actually lies?
Yeah, I think there has to be just basic assurances in place to do checks and balances internally. But I also think it's like, more importantly than where the money came from, because me and you have done international business before. Like, I used to get paid by a citizen in Libya for contracting. So, I mean, this stuff could get convoluted, but it ends up being more so, what are the actual do outs? What is the ask? And if these guys are being told, hey, we want you to say this thing in Russian, or this thing that is manipulated that looks like it's propagating or supporting a different country, then you sit back and you go, okay, this isn't something that we're comfortable with. I think the assurances lean more so on the actual company and its due diligence with its legal team. But man, at the same time, I'm like, how deep do these guys need to dive? I mean, you could use one cutout and be completely detached from Russia or any other country, and international business and foreign entities can set up businesses and LLCs in America very easily. I mean, at the same time that the DOJ is going after these guys because there was some kind of transaction on an advertisement, there's Chinese nationalists buying American land in Montana. So it's like, how much, like in one way we're focused on this. It's like, well, where do we draw the line? So I would say it falls on the company itself, but it only goes so deep. I mean, how deep do you need to go and to figure out and find out if somehow, some way there's international influence? It's like, man, that's just how the world works. That's how international business works. That's how American business works. And I imagine these specific influencers, I know 2 of them, had no idea and no clue, because they have people in place to manage this for them.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I would like to see, not that this is not important, and maybe it educates citizens, voters, maybe a little bit more on their worldview, not necessarily political view, but just view of the world and how nation states interact. I do fall back into a place where I would much rather see the DOJ looking for, you were a little bit wrong for the congressmen and senators. I think they make $200,000, Mike. So that's way more reasonable for them to be worth $100 million, right? Because it's twice as much as you thought they were making. I would love to know. I mean, again, the math on that, to me, this stuff is being done at plain sight on people who are supposed to be serving the American citizen. And why? Why are we not looking into that? I feel like if you were a businessman who somehow hit the radar of the U.S. government and showed that level of net worth increase, at a very minimum, you would have the IRS 3/4 of the way up your ass on a yearly basis trying to figure out how. But yet the people that we elect into office seem to be able to do this in plain sight.
Yeah, my experience with double dipping in the military was short-lived, because when I was a young SF guy, I wanted to bounce at a local bar to make money on the weekends, and that got shut down by the JAG office because they thought, one, it was inappropriate, and two, it was a conflict of interest. And I'm like, I just want to work a job. This is not an illegal job. It's a legitimate job where I make legitimate money, and I'm being ultra legitimate because I'm coming to you trying to get approval, and I couldn't get approval. Fast forward like 10 years after that moment, still in the military, I got approved to run a photography business, and they wanted all of this regulation of the tax information. They wanted to know the transactions that I was going through. And I'm like, what business is it and what regulation is it to where the U.S. military wants to track a sergeant first class's ability to make a living on the side with a photography business? And I had to get approved through the military. I had to talk about it during my clearances for my top secret SCI. And you see that level of attention to detail for a Joe in the Army. And then you look at politicians and you're like, well, wait a minute. He just made $10 million last year. Oh, he got $500,000 to speak at an event for an hour. And that's not raising the attention of the Department of Justice or anybody for that matter. And I think that's the bigger issue. And I think most of our listeners who hear this story, the first thing they think is not, oh, yeah, because we know Dave Rubin and we know Tim Pool, those guys are corrupt. They think, okay, what's the government really doing here? And that's the better question. I think that's and that's valid, completely valid.
Yeah, man. I agree.
Order now. The two women who were killed and found dismembered in Juarez on Sunday were from El Paso.
On the southern border, there is a legal concept known as reasonable fear, a lifeline for those fleeing violence.
A Texas couple was found tortured and murdered.
Police say so far this month, 11 women have been killed in Juarez.
And then their bodies or body parts offered up to Santa Muerte as an offering. She represents death.
In this special Borderland docuseries, I take a deep dive onto true crime stories. Join me as we uncover the truth about the fear behind the crisis.
This was a group of powerful people.
Never been seen before in Mexico.
Evidence of ritualistic elements.
We ended up rescuing almost 200 kids.
The discovery of multiple women in mass graves.
They're almost in every state. When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map.
But even more violent.